Hi and welcome. In this chapter, we will see what is routing and how routing works in AWS. So, by statement, routing is nothing but the process of path selection in any network. So, it means if you wanted to send your traffic from one source to another destination, there is a path. So, this is similar to, let's say, if you wanted to travel from one destination to another destination, you have to either take a train or flight or bus, or you can go by car. So similarly, in networking, there are a number of paths in order to reach the destination, and you need to select the best path so that it can take you less time to reach the destination. So this is called routing, where we are selecting the path for the traffic. So if you talk about AWS, for example, let's say you have a VPC over here. So in this VPC, you may have subnets. For example, let's say the VPC address space is 10.0.0.0/22, and then you have a subnet 1. The IP address range of the subnet 1 is 10.0.0.0/24, and subnet 2 you may have 10.0.1.0/24. Now you have deployed a virtual machine over here, as well as you have one more virtual machine over here. So let's say if you wanted to communicate from this virtual machine to this virtual machine, or from here to here, so you need to have something called a route table. So if you do not have route table, the VM doesn't know how to send the traffic from here to the another side so that it can communicate each other. Similarly, let's say you have internet. This is, imagine this is your internet and this is your on premise. So let's say from this virtual machine, if you wanted to communicate to the internet, or from internet you wanted to communicate to this virtual machine, or let's say if you wanted to communicate from this virtual machine to your on-premise network. Similarly, from the on-premise, if you wanted to communicate to your virtual machine in the AWS, you should have something called a route table. Otherwise, your virtual machine doesn't know how to reach the internet or how to reach the on-premise. So there comes something called route table. So in the route table, we are mentioning in order to reach internet, you have to take path X, or in order to reach on-premise, you have to take path Y. So similarly, let's say if you wanted to reach from here one subnet to the another subnet also, you need to take some XYZ path. For example, in the route table, you are basically mentioning, okay, if you wanted to go to on-premise, take path X. If you wanted to go to the internet, then take path Y, and if you wanted to go to the another subnet, then take path Z. So these are the entries you're going to enter into the route table. So once you have this entry in your route table, then you are going to attach this route table to the subnet. For example, say if you wanted to send the traffic from this virtual machine to the internet or on-prem or to the another one, then first you need to create a route table, and then you need to enter the entry into the route table. So once you have the entry, then you have to attach that route table to this particular subnet. So always remember, a route table you are going to attach to the subnet level and not to the VPC level. So this is how routing works in AWS. So one important note when it comes to route table is, when you create your first VPC or when you create any VPC in your AWS account, by default Amazon Web Service will create a default route table for you, which is called as main route table. So this is by default attached to all the subnets. So by default, in your main route table, you have a default routing entry which is belongs to your VPC, that is 10.0.0.0/22, and it is saying that local. So it means using this route table you can communicate each other within your subnets. So by default this entry will be there, which allow you to communicate between your subnets. So for example, let's say in your VPC you have three or more subnets. For example, let's say subnet 3, or you may have subnet 4, and you have a number of virtual machine inside this. So by default you can communicate with each other within your VPC. So this is because you have a default routing entry which is saying that within your VPC you have to communicate. So this is the default entry will be there in your main route table, and by default it is attached to all the subnets. Let's say if you wanted to override, or if you wanted to create your own route table and you wanted to enter your own routing entry, etc., then you need to create something called custom routing table or custom route. So let's say if you wanted to block inter subnet communication, or if you don't want this communication to happen, or if you wanted to create your own routes for some other reasons, so you don't want to use the default routing table, then you can create a custom routing table. And in this custom routing table you can enter the custom routing entry, and then you can attach this to either subnet 1 or subnet 2 or subnet 3, etc., etc. And one important note, you can attach single routing table to multiple subnets, but you cannot attach multiple routing table to single subnet. So this is the important point you have to remember. So let's say once you have the routing table, etc., so always make sure that you have these things in your mind. The first one is each subnet in your VPC must be associated with the one route table which controls the routing for the subnet. So it means every subnet should have a route table. So even though if you do not create any new route table or attach to it, by default it comes with the main route table. So always you'll have a route table by default. The second one is the main route table automatically comes with the VPC. It controls the routing for all the subnets that are not explicitly associated with any routing table. It means by default in your VPC, it comes with the default route table which is called as main route table. So it will control the traffic in the subnet which are not explicitly associated with any other route table. It means if you do not bind any route table to your subnets, by default it will take the main route table. The third one is custom route table is empty by default, and you have to add as per your requirement. It means let's say if you create a new route table which is a custom route table, by default it comes with the zero entry. So it means you have to add the entry, or you have to specify the source and destination, how to reach. So by default it doesn't comes with any entries, whereas in main you have the default one which will allow you to communicate within the subnets or within the VPC. The fourth one is a subnet can be associated with one route table at a time, but you can associate multiple subnets with the same subnet route table. It means one route table can be attached to multiple subnets. However, multiple route table you cannot attach to single subnet. And fifth one is every route table contains a local route for the communication within the VPC. It means by default in your main route table you will have a routing entry, so it will allow you to communicate within the subnet or within the VPC. So this is the brief about route table.